A well-constructed game allows a shared space where content, frame, and procedure allows participants to explore, expand, and start dialogue. In our first pod session for Game to Change, we have invited Natasha Winkler, an engaged leader and registered industrial psychologist who has led large-scale change initiatives to drive business results and people development. Natasha has been a pioneer in introducing experiential and game-based approaches to large-scale culture change projects. And we're really looking forward to sharing her knowledge and experience of adopting this approach today. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks very much, Deirdre.
Great. So, Natasha, just to start off the conversation, just give us a brief motivation of why you decided to incorporate this approach as part of your culture and change strategy.
Okay. Thanks very much, Deirdre. I really appreciate being part of this podcast. And as you know, my passion is really change and specifically organizational change. So I look forward to having this conversation. I want to start the question with a little bit of context. Firstly, as somebody that's been working in the organizational change field for more than 20 years now, I obviously grew up with very planned and structured methodologies around how to do change, was schooled in all of those, did my master's in industrial psychology, but specifically focusing on organizational development and change. And through these years, I've obviously learned about different types of change and different types of levels of impact. And one of the things that I first need to warn about is we have to be very careful around a cookie cut approach to change. So there's lots of models out there, and there seems to be an inclination to take a methodology and just plug and play. So that's the first thing I just want to caution about. Now, coming back to the change that I want to discuss with you today, the culture change program in a mining organization. Culture, as we are aware, is really the simple definition of culture is the way we do things around here. It's the feel and the smell and the vibe you get when you walk into an environment, whether it's a country, a society, a community, or in an organization. So culture change is deeply behavioral. So if you want to embed a new culture, it in essence means you have defined a new way of being. That definition is obviously written. It's either in value statements, it's behavioral definitions, and what leadership and what consultants is trying to do is embed that in the behavior of all employees. In the organizational change theory, the theory distinguishes between diagnostic and dialogic models and approaches to change. A diagnostic perspective is very appropriate when you do something that's very planned, you know what the outcome's going to look like, etc. Most of our traditional organizational change tools is based on a diagnostic perspective. However, for a deeply behavioral change, a more dialogic approach is more appropriate. And there are also a number of methodologies and tools, for example, conversation metaphors, world cafe approaches, etc., appreciative inquiry, that is referred to as a dialogic approach. And a dialogic approach focuses on social constructionism and meaning making. It's about creating change that creates a new way or a new conversation in the organization. The transformation is more emergent. So as much as you plan, you have you basically have an end state in the definition of the new culture, but how exactly and the tempo at which we're going to get there is not exactly defined and planned. And then usually the consultant is part of the process, so not apart from the process facilitating it, but is very much immersed in the process. I also want to fall back on what Franklin has told us about, you know, the 70-20-10 principle in learning. If you tell me something, I'm going to forget it. If you teach me, I'm going to remember it. But if you involve me, I'm actually going to learn and I'm going to change my behavior. So as you're aware, as a gaming expert, a well-constructed game can open that dialogue. And immediately you can see the link between dialogical approaches to change and using gamification to open up that dialogue so that we can get involvement. Games overall is a non-threatening type of activity. So it opens neural pathways in your brain where you are more creative and more open to learning. You are not closed off and defensive. And games also bring a new energy and motivation, which are all things that contribute to transformation and change.
Yes, and creating that immersion.
That I mentioned, exactly. Because if you bring different type of people in, you can't always predict exactly what the output's going to be. So it's very immersive and on the spot. But I want to, while you mentioned that, I want to focus on that. I did emphasize a well-constructed game. So Deirdre, in the past, organizational change facilitation, especially deep behavioral change or teamwork or things like that, was very dependent on organizational psychologists. Because of our understanding of human psyche and behavior, we could literally, in that moment, understand the dynamic, the psychological dynamic that is happening and facilitate it. Where what I found is that if you have a very good constructed game, it can achieve a lot of that without necessarily having an expert in human behavior in the session. But I will come back to that a little bit more. Back to our culture change. So we had a few principles that was very important. Firstly, as I said, if you want to change behavior, you need to start the mental paradigms, how people think. So our program was focused on changing mindsets, but then at the same time to get the buy-in. Because if people are not emotionally connected to the new world of work or the new way of being, the buy-in is going to be short-lived. But then immediately after, this needs to be inculcated in the way we do things. So your systems, your processes, so action that comes out of that. So that was one of the key principles. And again, when we talk about the games, we can talk more around how that facilitated that head, heart, and feet or action principle. So lastly, to come back on the motivation for incorporating games, there were two critical elements in the transformation journey. We utilize a methodology or a thing called conversation metaphor. I'm not going to go too much in detail about that, but that is also an approach to embed a new way of being. And we use games as an experiential learning approach to embed that new conversation metaphor or the new culture. So that in a nutshell is a little bit of the background on how we came to use games in this project.
Excellent. That sounds very exciting. I mean, it's narrative and your games bringing that immersion together.
Yeah.
Great. So if you could just give me a brief overview of the games and the tools that were used in the organization.
Okay. Again, without having planned it in so much detail, we ended off with quite a coherent approach. So as I said, our principles was head, heart, feet consistently. Our principle was everything about us or nothing about us without us. It was a little bit of a slogan we used in the company. And basically what it says is, if you want to change something that impacts me or my behavior or my work, you will include me in the dialogue. Obviously, we had 25,000 people, so we had to get really creative around inclusivity and engagement. But we found ways and methods to get all the voices in. So our approach was very much, it's about leadership, it's about employee engagement, and including all our stakeholders. The employee engagement wasn't, leadership wasn't just about the top 250 employees. It was around any person that is in a role of influencing somebody else. So obviously with the new culture, it requires a new leadership style that was also
Yes.
embedded. So that new leadership style had to be embedded and in some instances even taught in the organization.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the employee engagement or the culture was applicable to all employees, even managers, because at some point after being a manager, you are also an employee.
Yes.
So one thing that I want to emphasize as well, employee engagement or employment is more than just an employment contract. We must remember that it's a psychological contract. People are not just at companies for what's in their employment contract. There is a very strong psychological contract, and we've seen numerous of studies that have proven to us the importance and the essence of a strong psychological contract, strong commitment, high employee engagement leads to successful and sustainable organizations.
Yes.
Also, some of our tactics and tools is to make sure everything is aligned to our communication and other reinforcement tactics. And then lastly, embedding it in the system. In other words, everything else, the way you operate, the way you do HR practices, the way you do business processes needs to align to the desired culture. The types of games and tools we used, so this is where I said, well, it was absolutely not planned, but it just worked out perfectly. When we did our leadership development, we used not actually a psychometric assessment. It was a 360 feedback tool where we created a space where subordinates could give feedback to the leaders. I think for confidentiality purposes, I won't mention the tool. But it was an instrument where we did real deep behavioral work, where a standard leadership style was defined, and people were then measured, or they got feedback around how others perceive them on this style. So in the leadership journey, we literally had this thing where we had the leadership mat or the leadership circle mat. And when leaders do a team session, they would go on the mat to unpack that. And it touched a lot on ID and understand what their identity was and how in touch they were. So addressing emotional intelligence and understanding how people perceive them.
Wow.
So when we introduced the workforce engagement and the conversation metaphor component, and we introduced the games, it was interesting that the specific game and tool we chose was something called Spin the Wheel. And we had a board game version of it, but we also had a team, a longer 2-hour session version of it. There was also a mat that you put out. So that was just interesting for me how it came together. Okay. So we had the board games, we had short and longer versions. The board games was very experiential, so it included activities, it included discussion, it included serious conversation versus just lighthearted fun conversation. It was always around focusing on yourself, how you think about something, how you feel about something, and what do you do about that thing. And that was very similar to what we were doing in leadership. And after each game or session, there would always be actions and commitments around how we can change things toward the desired culture. So the board games could literally be played in a work context in 10 minutes, or you can use a longer version for a whole day team building session. Okay, so those are the types and tools and tricks we used.
And it's interesting that when you ran the leadership, was that obviously before you brought in the conversation metaphors and the games? So you created that readiness.
Yes. So the thinking around conversation metaphor was always part of the plan because it is a scientifically sound approach to embedding new behavior. But as with culture change, you always run your leadership a little bit ahead of the workforce engagement because you need to prepare the leadership to drive that through their employees as well. Again, as I said, the consultant is not there to do, but to facilitate. So the real change is being facilitated by the leadership at all levels.
Great, interesting, very pertinent point, because often organizations think we're going to bring these consultants in and they're going to take care of this and change our culture. But you really there to facilitate that.
Exactly. And when we talk about design elements and practical considerations, I'll talk more around that, because obviously you can imagine we pay a consultant, you come do this stuff, you
Yes.
do the work. But now suddenly you have to teach managers to play games and to facilitate games. And obviously they think it's a whole lot of fun, but we're here to do real work. We're here to mind.
Yes. Yes.
So that's an interesting dynamic, but it absolutely worked.
Okay, excellent. And in terms of when you obviously went through this process, what were the design elements and practical considerations that you had to look at when you decided to take this approach, and even any learnings out of it?
Okay, I actually gave this a little bit of thought, because it was a while back. But there are probably 4 things that really stood out for me that I think is worth mentioning. The first one is extremely practical, and we often overlook it. But something like language, we must be very careful not to underestimate the proficiency of people, especially when it comes to big transformational type change. If it's something superficial, most people can understand English. But if you're suddenly talking about integrity and what that means, because integrity is not a definition that you put out there. Integrity is what I bring from my background, my upbringing, my schooling, the village that I lived in. How did we define integrity? We had an interesting one. Our whole journey was called the Journey to Significance, for example. And initially, some of the senior leadership had a challenge with the word significance, because they felt, not everybody will relate to it. And if you understand the concept of significance, there are people that live in rural, traditional homesteads that live more significant lives than us in beautiful concrete jungle. So I think the understanding of that word was a lot more embedded at the lower levels than in some parts of the organization. So language became an important element. And again, because we took a dialogic approach, we had to be extra careful around unintended consequences or interpretation. So just in terms of the design of the actual games, the cards, the instructions, the manual, how you facilitate it, we had to be cognizant of language. The other thing that's also very important and very practical is the type of scenarios, because in the games is also always about scenarios, whether it's a serious business game or whether it's a fun snakes and ladder. It's about the scenario. So you have to be extremely appropriate. We are not here, yes, it's fun, but we're not really here to have fun. We are here to deal with real behavioral, cultural challenges, and we are wanting to move to a desired state. So the scenarios need to be able to be taken back into the work context. So if you play a game and they have to do a challenge or answer a question, it must be as close as possible to their actual work environment. So somebody working in a underground mining environment, you don't ask them questions about the financial system of the country. You ask questions that's very topical to their world of work. The third thing, and now that I've mentioned it as well, you need to be cognizant of physical constraints where these people work. We often get very comfortable in our air conditions offices and our fixed timing, and we can come and go into a corporate office and it's easier to schedule things. But majority of people work in very harsh conditions, underground mines, or there's no real space to play games or do things. They are scheduled and planned exact times to do their work in. So there's no extra time before or after to play games. So all of these things need to be taken into account, because you want to bring all of this very close to the real world.
Yes.
And then just aside, for us, durability was also an issue.
Yes,
because we were oftentimes in a harsh process refining area, or in a underground mine, and even the material that the game is manufactured in had to be durable, because these guys play with it and they throw it, etc. And then lastly, obviously, you have to be cognizant of time and costs. So we want to change, but also we want to spend money on things that's really going to facilitate the change. So cost is always a challenge. And then the timing. Firstly, to develop the scenarios and develop the tools, but also the time to embed it in the organization.
Yeah, definitely. And especially with something that is large scale, it's not a simple one workshop you run out with. I mean, you ran out with hundreds, but you did it in a clever way where it was, I don't want to say scalable, but you could replicate it. You could replicate that experience on multiple levels.
And coming back to the principles of embedding behavioral change is to get as wide as possible a voice into the development. So even when we were designing the games, it was not consultants doing it. The words, the actions, the scenarios, the questions came from the floor, if you can put it that way. And that takes time as well. And yeah, I'll go into that a little bit more.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that, because I think it talks back to that whole understanding your users and understanding your users' experience and how you do that and how you embed that into what you want to do. So the next question, and something that I've read a lot about, and in the game, using games, gamification, one of the well-known gurus that calls it the magic circle. And the magic circle is where structure and interaction of a game allows a new reality to be created. So it sounds pretty out there, something out of a Harry Potter movie. But I mean, from my experience, I've seen it in the projects we've run. I mean, for me, there is magic in that. And I wanted to just get your experience of obviously seeing these sessions, and do you think that some of this magic was created?
Deirdre, I want to start off to say, where there's a will, there's a way. The will, very much on myself as the project coordinator, I actually just called myself a change provocateur, because I just provoked wherever I came. The will to do this and do it in the right way was so strong, and I took a lot of beating, and it was challenging at times, but I was fixed on the principle of we have to do it right. But then, having said that, that's my job. Change is my job. I got paid for it, so that's fine. But one thing that I can say, the leadership in the organization, and not just the CEO and not just the steering committee, but leadership at all levels, in all pockets of the organization, the will that I saw from them, that, they were totally buying into this, even from the union perspective. They knew that this is a prerogative. It needs to happen. So where there's a will, there's a way. Okay, so we made it work. First of all, I think, again, coming back to the dialogic approach that we take, your concept of the magic circle and the new creations that you get out of a game, it speaks very much into a dialogic approach, because as I mentioned earlier, the dialogic approach is foundationed on social constructionism. And social constructionism is around creating as you go. It's saying when you bring one person and you bring another person, something new is going to evolve, because we may have the same understanding of a thing or an object, but we bring a whole lot of history and knowledge and insights and experiences around that thing. And if we share that, there's going to be new knowledge and history and things created. So that's really what. So I'm a firm believer. I'm not much of a positivist. I don't believe everything is factual,
empirical,
empirical. Well, even constructionism can be empirical.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing around the dialogic approach. Secondly, we had an interesting approach that we also used in the business. The CEO actually introduced it to his leadership team before our project came along. And it is The Third Alternative by Covey. I don't know if you've read that book. So Covey wrote the book of The Third Alternative, and it is really about us striving for synergy. And the emphasis is synergy, not compromise. So if you think about the old way of talking, it's about that win-win situation. If we come together, even if there's a conflict, that if we can find each other, we will come to a greater awareness, a new resolution, something better than what we could have achieved on our own. And the foundation of that, he talks about see, do, get. Okay. And what Covey says, and I want to say it in his words, basically, he said, our paradigm governs our behavior. Again, how we think is how we're going to behave, which in turn governs the consequence of our actions. So we get results based on what we do, and we do depending on how we see the world. So seeing the world means I first have to understand myself, and then I have to seek you out to understand you. Okay. And again, phenomenally, this was very much the basis of our leadership work, but we built it into our games and our approach that we took there as well. So even in the games, it always started with the individual. How do you behave in this? How do you think about this? What are your actions? And then how should we do it as a team? Okay. Yes. So that co-creation and that development for me, again, speaks into what we were trying to achieve. And the only way you can achieve a new way of being is when people really do the work within themselves to understand the why of their actions. Why am I doing things this way? Why am I thinking in this way? Why am I behaving? Why do I react in this way? And once you get a grip on that, then to seek out and try and understand, and that requires also much compassion.
Okay,
so that's
excellent.
about as much as I can say to you.
Well, I think there's definitely, I mean, the self-awareness and then taking it out. I think that's really where shifts happen, and that is magic.
Yeah.
So looking back, you know, so you've pioneered this, and you've had the fortitude to take a new approach and obviously take it into a large scale environment, and any other organizational development practitioner for people who are dealing with change and is listening to this and you know, obviously they're seeing the possibility of what they could do with this approach. What advice would you give them?
So, Deirdre, again, I most certainly do not see myself as the expert or the most knowledgeable person in this, but I'm just merely sharing my experience in many years of doing this type of things. So one of the first things, and we know we talk about it, and it's in every book and it's in every guideline, but I am going to emphasize it because it is just so true. Your CEO, chief champion, there is no getting around that. Not just championing it verbally, but actually believing. So all the work that we did across the organization, we had to do with him. Understanding that, why are you looking at this? Why are you wanting to do this? As I said, in this specific case, the motto or the name of the journey was actually the journey to significance. And significance to me has an extremely deep meaning. So I always, in our EXCO meetings, in our CEO briefings, I always check them on that. Say, when you did that press release, when you spoke with the media, were you very significant at that point? When you're doing that new deal, when you're saying something for our communities, So they were consistently, and it's not a perfect world either. And for me, the CEO believing it, loving it, doing it, sponsoring it is really where the magic happens. Firstly, it's all where the magic starts. And when he can start becoming vulnerable, because all of this work, as you would have picked up by now, there's a lot of vulnerability in there.
Yes.
So if he can start and he's vulnerable, it sets the tone. The last thing I mentioned there, the sponsorship, this thing costs money. Because as with anything, if you want to digitize your organization, if you want to reorganize, if you want to go into a new venture, you put the financial backing to it. If you want to change the culture, you need to put the money into it as well. You also need to sponsor it, that it's going to be a long-term journey. It is not a once-off. It's not a happy, clappy communication, employee fun day at the zoo type of interventions. It is ongoing and sustainable, and that takes time. The second thing, and I alluded to it earlier, the nice thing about using games is if you construct the game adequately, any person can facilitate, and you can get the benefit out of the deep behavioral conversation you are looking for in the session out of the game. So you're not dependent on a behavioral expert. So what we found is by building all of that in the games and the scenarios and how they debrief and what questions to ask, anyone could facilitate it. So we basically taught we coached our leaders in how to host and facilitate the games. So there was no need for a behavioral expert, which also meant they could really do it in business, on the shop floor, in their safety brief before they start a job, etc., etc. I mentioned to it already, the consultant is part of the process, not on the side, not project managing, really part of get involved and be part of the conversation. And lastly, you have to know your audience. You have to know who you're talking to. In other words, you have to customize the games. I spoke about language earlier, the examples, the scenarios, etc. So you really, really, really need to understand. And in our case, it worked in our favor that the business was so involved in the conversation metaphor process because they designed the content of the games.
So they took ownership for that. So Natasha, we've come to the end, but I it's such an interesting topic, and I think we could probably carry on for another hour. Is there any other critical, pertinent points that you'd just like to mention, or just to make the audience aware of?
Deirdre, I always believe we need to learn from what we do. So this is a brilliant thing that you're doing. And so we should take these learnings and just make the next culture project even better. So one thing that I can already say, fortunately, we did it in this because I had the learning from my previous work, is we need to educate leaders on what change is. Coming back to my first point, that cookie cutter, everybody's doing an MBA, so they learn the models and they come plug and play. We shouldn't assume that people understand how to manage change. It is the most probably overstudied phenomenon. We've got 60 years of theory and research and books and models, but we are still having a 70 to 80% failure rate in successful change. So, and for me, it's not attributed to the theory not being adequate, it's how we apply it. So we must educate leaders on what is change, what is this that you're trying to do, you understand the impact of what you're trying to achieve, and then also educate them on the approach we're going to take. As I said, we didn't have a clear defined plan, so exactly when and what and how we're going to do. But we had an approach. We knew we were going to do leadership development. We knew we had to do employee engagement. We knew we had to monitor and track as we were going. We knew we had to embed this thing. So we had the broad framework, and we had to consistently educate our ExCo, our steering committee, our business leaders on what these things mean and how you do it. Okay. everything that you do in the culture work and specifically in the games must align to your business as usual, the day in the life of. How the person gets to work, the transport system, how much time do they have? How do they schedule and plan the work? When do they have moments? When they have a safety brief before work, can you build in the elements of a culture conversation in that moment? And don't make it about culture, making it about business, but bringing in the behavioral side to it. So you have to incorporate. It must be one. You don't have behavior and then work. It's all happens in the same. I mentioned that already. Co-create with the business. It's not I'm not an expert in mining, and there's no way I can learn the business in 6 months. So do it with the business, real life scenarios, and the language and the lingo and the things they use when they're underground. Okay? We know it's been demonstrated that a happy workplace is a productive workplace. So we also look, if you look at kids, most of the time kids play more than adults, and they also have more fun than adults, and they also just happen to learn more than adults and faster. So I think it's time we take a learning from kids and bring that component of happiness and fun back into our workplaces. So yeah, that's about as much as I can share in the time we have.
Excellent, Natasha. I think it's a really very engaging. I mean, your knowledge and your experience around this and taking this approach has been really fascinating. Even though I was part of it, I've gained a lot through that. And if people want to get hold of you or have a further discussion, can they find you on LinkedIn?
Yes, yeah. So, Deirdre, as I mentioned, we are definitely going to write this up as a case study, specifically from a gamification angle, but also the change angle. So we will publish that soon. And then, yes, I've got a profile on LinkedIn, and they're very welcome to contact me at any point. I love sharing and talking about the learning and the experiences.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm hoping we can schedule something in the future where we can take it and deep dive into some of the learnings. But thank you for your time and for your input and expertise that you've shared with the group.
You're very welcome, Deirdre. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Look forward to
Great.
seeing it.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.